Recap in minutes. In today's video, we will be enjoying a historical war drama film based on a true story entitled To End All Wars. There will be spoilers ahead, chill out and enjoy. The movie begins with members of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders ceremonially marching in their city as they head off to join the Second World War and fight in the Pacific. Captain Ernest Gordon, the protagonist, narrates that during the march, they were joined by the commander of the 93rd Battalion Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart McLean, and his XO, Major Ian Campbell. But soon after, they were captured by the Japanese troops and were lined up together with Lieutenant Jim Reardon, the only American in their batch of captives, to whom they also addressed as Yanker. Together with hundreds of POWs, they were transported deep into the Thai jungle prison camp dubbed Camp Kanchanaburi. As soon as they arrive, Captain Ernest and the others see the other malnourished and sick POWs captured earlier at the start of the war. After lining up for formation, a Japanese NCO named Sergeant Ito orders the newly arrived troops to count off, and it was conveyed by a translator named Takashi Nagase. Sergeant Ito slaps the Scottish major to start counting off, but Major Ian fights back. As a result, the major was beaten up. Before things can come to an irreversible end for Ian, his CO, Colonel Stuart, steps in to stop the beating. Not soon after, the warden of the camp, Captain Noguchi, comes out to show the newcomers what happens to escapees. 3 men on their knees were shot at point-blank range to their side. They are then handed some documents to sign, which state that they will not try to escape. A man named Dusty Miller forces Major Ian gets on his knees as Takashi passes by. It was one way of showing respect for the Japanese or Korean troops. As payback for the incident earlier, Sergeant Ito tortures Colonel Stuart by forcing him to drink liters of water and punching his gut afterward. The sadistic jab continues until the Scot colonel passes out. Meanwhile, Captain Ernest and the others are vaguely briefed by their fellow captives on how to survive in the prison camp. Like for instance, for not bowing, Ernest receives a beating in the back which eventually lead him to come to the camp hospital, also known as the Death House. A bit later, with the help of Dusty, the colonel was brought to the Death House to recover from his injuries. Colonel Stuart, together with the officers, are discussing the possibility of escape after noticing that the Jap sentries were few in numbers. The camp doctor informs the officers that there's a reason for that. First, the locals were willing to rat them out in exchange for a bowl of rice. Second, the jungle is so dense that escape is very unlikely. Lastly, every escapee has been caught or died in 1,000 miles of hostile jungle. Despite the harsh conditions, there were some menial perks that the Jap tolerated. Like the sanctuary Dusty built outside the camp. They were allowed to visit it freely, knowing full well that they practically had nowhere to go. The following day, the Jap chief administrator for all POWs in Thailand, named Lieutenant Colonel Nagatomo, arrives. He then calls in for the officers in the house and informs them that they will be making a railroad 420 kilometers long within 18 months. Colonel Stuart then rages on the fact that his men can't manage it with the rations given to them. When asked about the papers, Colonel Stuart insults the Japs by throwing them at the Nagatomo's face. The Scot colonel ends up paying for the disrespect with his life. To many members of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, Colonel Stuart was more than an officer, he was also a father they could look up to. When given the opportunity, they buried the colonel. Major Ian changes his mind about the escape. But the American felt betrayed. Captain Ernest tries to pacify the situation, but Yanker isn't having it. Soon, the railroad construction starts. The Japs were preparing to invade India, and the railway would be their supply line. Rain or shine, the prisoners would face unfathomable and endless troubles. Aside from endless hunger, they were faced with various diseases. One evening, Captain Ernest was burning up and clinging on to dear life. With death as a daily occurrence, the doc, the major, and Yanker gave up on the poor Scot. Late in the evening, Ernest's body was transferred to a hut where the dying or dead captives were kept. Dusty was about to leave the place when Ernest started shouting. Despite their heavy workload, Dusty continues to nurse Ernest back to health. The Scot captain later discovers that Dusty sacrificed his rations to feed him. The tables have turned. Days later, it was Ernest who was looking after Dusty. Captain Ernest notifies his good friend that he'll be starting giving out classes. A jungle university in the one place where the Japs don't dare go, the hut with the dead bodies. The railroad construction continues. One evening, an English soldier named Sergeant Roger carries his platoon leader, a suicidal lieutenant named Foxworth, sees Ernest and asks if they could join and teach the class. Roger has a background in fine arts, and Foxworth, who's currently not himself, used to teach Shakespeare in Cambridge. Roger figures that if his lieutenant keeps himself busy long enough, he wouldn't have to kill himself. In the following days, both teachers and the students keep themselves sane and escape the monotonous, dismal, and somber slave mentality by going through classes. It gave them a tingle sensation of hope that could distract them from harsh realities. While everyone was doing their own thing, Major Ian was planning a coup. Ernest, Dusty, and Yanker disrupt the Major's meeting and try to talk sense into Ian. Even if they did become successful in taking on the guards and retrieving their guns, they still had nowhere to go. On top of that, they still have to face a whole Jap regiment, 1,000 man strong, armed to the very teeth. One evening, Ian reports to the Japanese guards of Yanker's illegal activities. To the Major, Yanker has no loyalty except to himself and sees the American as a threat. But truth be told, he was just trying to be resourceful and survive. The Yanker wasn't the only one reported. Ian also snitched on the evening classes happening in the camp and had Dusty pay for it. The Major did all these to get his plan of fighting back on track. Despite the crackdown, Ernest, Dusty, and the others continue working diligently with their belief of staying complacent and turning the other cheek. The Japs were taking notice of their good behavior, but for the Major, it was eating him out. The prisoners' hard work didn't go unnoticed. Captain Noguchi gives back the books and rewards them with different kinds of goods. Later that evening, Yanker was eventually set free after being bound to the ground for days on end. Ernest narrates that Yanker changed and wasn't talking as much. For the following days, the captives had it good. Classes were being held in the open, they were allowed to do a play, and coincidentally, for the first time in a long time, they had meat. One morning, while the prisoners were playing against the guards in football, Ernest had a brief conversation with Takashi. The Scot learned that Takashi was educated in Cambridge but was classified as low physical fitness, hence, he was assigned to a prison camp. For a Jap soldier, that was more like a punishment. But Sergeant Ito's case was different. He took the fall after most of his squadmates died. For the Bushido Code, it's an honor to be punished in place of one's superior. Despite the better treatment, Ernest and many others were still pals. They were forced to do manual labor and starved by the Japanese army. The railroad was finished in October of 1943, 6 months ahead of schedule. After the opening ceremony for the tracks, the prisoners are information and were informed that a couple dozens of captives would be transferred to another camp. It hindered the Major's plan since half were his men. Minutes later, a Jap reports to Sergeant Ito that one shovel was missing. The Japanese sergeant then has Takashi translate that the whole company will suffer if no one steps forward and tells where the missing shovel is. Yanker steps forward, and Ito starts beating him up to a pulp. The incident left Yanker paralyzed from the waist down. Before it could turn horrible, another Jap soldier confirmed that it was a simple miscount and no shovel was missing. It was graduation night, all the Japs were invited to attend the improvised ceremony. Knowing full well that all eyes will be on the rites and the play, Major Ian and 5 of his men take the opportunity to set their plan in motion. They kill 2 guards and break into the armory. They manage to get hold of the guns, but there wasn't any ammo. Suddenly, they hear B-24s passing by. The prisoners cheer up, knowing that with Allies planes overhead, the war was turning. But amidst the celebration, Sergeant Ito spots the dead guard and apprehends Major Ian and his co-conspirators. The plan foils, and the very next day, every POW were mandated to stand at attention as they witnessed Major Ian and his men's execution. One of the Scots stood up and started walking. He didn't make it far and was shot in the back. Not soon after, everyone except Major Ian was shot dead. Sergeant Ito then pulls out his katana, but before he can execute Ian, Dusty steps forward and takes the blame. Afterward, Sergeant Ito orders Dusty to be taken to the cemetery and have Major Ian set free. The Major starts sobbing and can't think straight after losing his men. Meanwhile, Ito nails Dusty to the cross prepared outside the camp. The Japs then stood up the cross for everyone to see. This will serve as a warning for those who have any plans to fight back and disobey their Jap captors. Captain Ernest and many of the prisoners are left speechless. Not one could utter a word. Sergeant Ito, on the other hand, for whatever reason, starts tearing up. He might have been brutal with the punishment but respected the fact that Dusty sacrificed himself for Major Ian. After the crucifixion, many of the POWs lost hope. The courage and the will to survive that they've gathered throughout the years of being enslaved were crumbling into even deep despair. They all felt that God was playing a cruel joke on them. They've buried the hero, and everyone attended. Subsequently, days passed as usual. The POWs were instructed to gather information because of an announcement. But before Takashi could finish what he had to say, B-24 engines were roaring in the background. Everyone looked up. The captives thought that their deliverance had finally come, that they'll be free from Japanese hands, but boy were they wrong. Their own allies thought they were the enemy and started carpet bombing the whole area. Everyone scrambles, looking for cover. Captain Ernest helps yank her up from his wheelchair in search of safety. Sergeant Ito and the other Jap camp guards tried to pump water into buckets and stop the fire from spreading. On the other hand, Ernest runs over his fellow countryman, who got his leg obliterated. The dying man exclaims that he almost made it but is about to be killed by his own side. While the bombing was going on, Captain Noguchi radios his superiors and reports the situation. It was total chaos. Jap or not Jap, everyone was ducking for cover. After the B-24 bombardment run, some Japanese soldiers from the nearby camps arrive in hopes of getting help, but Sergeant Ito turns them away. Things were getting awkward as the Jap truck's engine wasn't coming to life. Despite Major Ian's order, Captain Ernest goes to help the injured Japs, stating that they're still human beings. At first, some of the pals were hesitant, but they soon followed Ernest's lead. While everyone's distracted, Captain Noguchi uses the opportunity to escape from the dense forest. The camp was relatively quiet that day. The pals were left alone by their captors. Later, a plane flies overhead and drops notes addressing all prisoners of war. It states that the Japanese army surrendered unconditionally, finally ending the war. After years of hardship, the troops were able to smile again. Their long suffering is finally over. Soon, Allies troops find the prison camp. The POWs didn't know how to react and just stayed silent for a moment. Suddenly, a shout echoes throughout the camp. Ernest runs over to see what it is. Turns out, Major Campbell was torturing Sergeant Ito. He tries to stop the Major from killing Ito, but in a plot twist, Sergeant Ito kills himself. Unable to bear the shame of defeat. A true samurai to the very end. The movie ends 55 years later. Captain Ernest Gordon reunites with Imperial translator, Takashi Nagase back in the graveyard in Thailand. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more videos like this and to help the channel grow.